Feminists were obviously disappointed by the Ghomeshi Verdict, in which the former CBC media darling was found not guilty on sex assault charges. Academic legal theory holds the key to understanding how we got to the point where the presumption of innocence is under attack in sexual assault law. That's my subject on today's Fiamengo file. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. Like many North Americans, I was spellbound by the Ghomeshi trial in all its lurid drama, especially the light it has shed on contemporary feminist legal advocacy. The trial told a story that in a sane world would have delivered a body blow to feminism, revealing so much that is wrong with the believe the women doctrine. Every single one of the complainants in the Ghomeshi case was shown to have lied repeatedly and outrageously, so much so that only the most self-deluded of magical thinkers could claim otherwise. Moreover, the complainant's behavior told a disturbing story about female complicity. While stating that they had suffered shocking abuse at Ghomeshi's hands, abuse so horrible that it left them wanting nothing to do with him ever again, it turned out that they had all pursued him ardently after the alleged abuse, singing his praises and offering themselves seductively in email invitations, even when he seemed distinctly uninterested. For any gal who's ever thrown herself at a man whose interest has waned, the spectacle of the women's persistence was, well, embarrassing. They were like stereotypes come to life, women who charged a man with sexual assault because he didn't care enough. But the feminist juggernaut wasn't checked by these revelations of lies, foolishness, and self-sabotage. If anything, feminists seemed galvanized, using the spectacle of women fawning all over the man who supposedly assaulted them to assert their unshakable faith in female truthfulness. In the need to balance, which is a code word for smash, the legal rights of the accused with greater protections for women, and the insistence on the entire transformation of the criminal justice system so that women can convict men of sexual assault just on their say-so. Every newspaper and magazine in the country had a feminist writer telling us that sexual assault trauma makes women do strange things, and that what women may say to a man during or after an assault may be the very opposite of what they really feel. That women are conditioned to lie about sexual assault a lot of the time, and do lie about sexual assault a lot of the time, but that shouldn't stop us from believing what they say this time. The underlying message seems to be that a compassionate society owes it to women to put men in jail, no matter what the women have done to mislead the man about their desires and intentions. Emma Healy in the Toronto Star had the gall to claim that the trial was really about our society's continuing inability to see women as complex human beings. It was hard to believe she'd been following the same trial when she stated that, quote, if a woman's reaction to trauma involves anything less than perfect behavior, people will be more inclined to dismiss that reaction, end quote. For Healy, it seemed, outright lying proves a woman's complexity. It's as if these women were characters in a feminist novel, rather than complainants bound by legal oath and seeking to have a man locked away in jail for years. Anne Kingston in Maclean's magazine used the same kind of question-begging argument, commenting that the trial revealed that, quote, the responses and reactions of sexual assault survivors may not conform to a scarlet letter script. End quote. Margaret Schimba in the Halifax Spectator was beating the same victim drum, claiming that the trial, quote, harkened back to days of yore when women were considered vile, sinful creatures without even the vestiges of a soul. What? These writers, and many more, seem to have imbibed so much feminist theory as to be unable to respond rationally to reality. None of them seemed to understand or care that this was a criminal trial, where legal standards exist to protect the accused from wrongful conviction. Their only concern, it seemed, was to celebrate women's humanity, which apparently means believing whatever any woman has to say, regardless of whether she perjured herself, colluded with other witnesses, or behaved in ways to completely undermine her claims. Schimba, the third writer who has taken a Women and the Law course at university, was explicitly in favor of throwing out the presumption of innocence altogether. She says, quote, "In sexual assault cases, we know what justice looks like when innocent until proven guilty is the assumed position. But what would justice look like if we believed the survivors?" End quote. To say that it wouldn't look like justice at all, but like mob rule, didn't seem to have occurred to her, or it had, and that's exactly what she wants, so long as the mob is a feminist mob and isn't coming for her. But at least Schimba admitted that she doesn't have any claim to legal expertise in how to remake the justice system. But not so Naomi Sayers and Samantha Peters, who published in the Huffington Post on the subject of, quote, reimagining how future sexual assault cases are heard. These two are really scary, not only because their ideal future system would see social justice replace regular justice, but because one of them, Samantha Peters, is described as a law student. Though claiming that they don't want to overturn the presumption of innocence, that's exactly what they want to do, to skew the court in the complainant's favor, radically altering the burden of proof such that the rights of so-called survivors would be prioritized over the rights of the accused. They tell us with no sense of irony or self-awareness that they, quote, believe all survivors of violence, especially sexual violence, end quote. One wonders why they advocate any trial at all, perhaps only to allow the, quote, survivor the chance to tell her story publicly, to display her wounds in front of a genuflecting judge and jury. They want, among other unspecified transformations, special training for judges to influence how judges make decisions about credibility based on intersectional feminist understandings of trauma and oppression. I'm tempted to say that it's shocking that someone trained in law would so happily contemplate discarding the law, but in fact, it's not shocking at all, since a philosophical movement intent on destroying and remaking the Western legal system has had a firm place in academic legal studies for decades. And if you really want to understand where so much of the thinking around the Ghomeshi trial has its foundation, you should check out this branch of legal theory because it's at the base of it all. It's called critical legal theory. The theory draws on feminist, anti-racist, and post-colonial theories, and it was pioneered by social justice legal activists within the American university system, such as Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, not coincidentally a mentor of Barack Obama at Harvard, Mary Matsuda, and Richard Delgado. The fundamental premise of critical legal theory is that the Western justice system is not in any way a neutral or unbiased body of laws and procedures. On the contrary, the system is a tool of power, set up to protect the interests of privileged white men. Critical legal theorists don't want to reform the system to make it more fair and neutral. They don't actually believe in the possibility of neutrality. They advocate remaking the system to advance the interests of the so-called marginalized and oppressed, women and people of color in particular. Their rationale is essentially, though they would never say so, legal and social revenge. They tell us over and over again that Women, for example, have been badly treated under the law in the past, with the implication that such bad treatment authorizes the bad treatment of men in the present. In fact, they feel that men, white men in particular, though Ghomeshi wasn't white and that didn't help him, that men could never be badly treated enough to satisfy the demands of cosmic justice. Of course, they would strenuously deny that revenge is their motive. What they say instead is that greater attention to social context is necessary in the application of law. In other words, uniform standards can't be applied to determine, for example, credibility or fair punishment. Thus, a woman who claims to be the victim of sexual violence, or the victim of an abusive husband, say, or the victim of postpartum depression, her behavior is to be judged according to different standards than would be applied to a man. One of the big problems with the theory, aside from its development of radically inequitable standards for different categories of people, is that it involves applying labels such as trauma victim or battered woman, while denying the standards of evidence necessary to determine whether the label fits in the first place. How do we know that this woman is a victim of trauma if we can't rigorously investigate the claim that she is? And we see this sleight of hand already in practice with the use of the words victim or survivor rather than complainant when referring to perjured witnesses, as in this case. Part of the thinking behind it all is that women and people of color, etc., are always already victims just by being who they are, and therefore they are specially deserving of belief and compensation, whereas a privileged man like Ghomeshi is by definition less deserving of belief because he has already had the experience of being thought credible just by who he is. It's a terrifying vision of a designedly unequal system, a system proud of its inequality and calling it a higher equality, a restorative equality. I believe feminists have won the narrative on this one, and we see the results of their victory even in the decision of the judge who did not find Ghomeshi guilty. Now, like the feminist commentators I've just criticized, I don't have legal training, so it may be that I am quite wrong in my reading of Justice William B. Horkin's judgment, and I invite viewers to tell me if I am. But here goes anyway. The judgment is, in my opinion, deeply influenced by the feminist narrative about how victims of sexual trauma cannot be judged according to reasonable standards. Influenced to such an extent that the judgment sets a very grave precedent for future cases, perhaps even future cases against Ghomeshi. In the case of the complainant Lucy de Coutere, it came out at trial that after the alleged choking incident at Ghomeshi's home, de Coutere maintained an intimate relationship with Ghomeshi over the rest of the weekend, sent him flowers after the weekend was over, thanking him for being such a good host, sent him loving and titillating emails, and continued to pursue a relationship with him for well over a year. All of this she had suppressed. When confronted with proof of all that she hadn't told, she claimed that she was going to tell it all at the trial, but simply hadn't had an opportunity yet to do so. The judge's comment on these suppressions is, in my opinion, ominously careful. He wrote, quote, "A natural assumption might be that what was actually stopping Ms. de Coutere from sharing all of this undisclosed information was the fear that to some audiences this post-event socializing would reflect badly on her claims that this man had in fact assaulted her. Had she genuinely feared that this sort of thinking would unfairly undermine her credibility, that concern might have been an explanation worth giving careful consideration." That's the end of the quotation. I don't know what to make of that. I find it striking that the judge states only that Ms. de Couterre's behavior might have undermined her credibility with, quote, some audiences. Surely what is germane to the case is not how some audiences might react. The question is whether a reasonable person would find on balance that Ms. de Couterre's behavior drastically weakened her claim to have been assaulted by Ghomeshi. In focusing entirely on the withholding of the information, the judge suggests that the behavior itself was less determinative than the fact of not disclosing it, and that if she had disclosed it with a good reason, then the behavior would not have proved anything. This seems to me dangerously close to the feminist position that traumatized survivors of sexual assault cannot be judged by ordinary standards, and that their yes may well mean no. In fact, they can say, yes, yes, more, please do it again, and it's still assault if they later declare it is. Here, feminists demand that the law get into murky regions of the female psyche where no reason-based system can or should go. Perhaps the judge felt that he didn't need to comment on de Couterre's behavior since her withholding of the evidence was so egregious, and given the feminist insistence that no behavior on the part of an alleged victim can be seen to disqualify her victim claim, maybe he simply avoided commentary that he knew would provoke ire. This was safe and prudent, perhaps, but not very clear. And it seems to me crucial that in a case such as this, a case receiving so much attention, the judge's verdict should have been crystal clear. I think the judge didn't want to get into the whole matter of the complainant's behavior, and that really worries me. Too often, for my liking, in fact, this judge seemed to go out of his way to acknowledge feminist positions in an approving manner. Regarding the first witness, L.R., now revealed to be Linda Redgrave, the judge explicitly evoked the feminist principle that victim credibility can't be judged on the basis of common sense standards. He wrote as follows, quote, "The expectation of how a victim of abuse will or should be expected to behave must not be assessed on the basis of stereotypical models. Having said that, I have no hesitation in saying that the behavior of this complainant is at the very least odd." End quote. I know I'm not the only person who has found this statement quite baffling. What exactly is or is not a stereotype in the judge's estimation? A stereotype is, in the loosest sense, a standard model, a predictable type of behavior. According to the feminists, practically any assumption of how a female sexual assault victim would likely behave is a stereotype. It's a stereotype, for example, to think that a victim wouldn't romantically pursue the man who assaulted her. So is the judge agreeing that this is a stereotype, but then judging L.R. on the basis of that stereotype anyway? Or is it not a stereotype? And if we are not to judge on the basis of stereotypes, how can we judge any behavior? After all, judges and juries in a court of law don't know victims personally. They can't judge on the basis of years of intimate knowledge. Now, we know what the feminists would say. We should judge on the basis of what feminist experts tell us is typical behavior of sexual assault survivors. But those feminist experts would be offering stereotypes too. In other words, standard models, predictable types. They would just happen to be feminist stereotypes. So the judge's statement makes no sense to me, and it concedes, in my opinion, far too much to a feminist theory in which women's behavior can be both irrational and yet credible at the same time. And that's how law is destroyed and innocent men convicted. Ultimately, I fear that the feminist narrative blaring out at us from nearly every newspaper and magazine about the Ghomeshi trial has been so successful in undermining reasonable standards that the only hope for a male defendant in a he said, she said trial such as this one is hard evidence of the complainant's lies. The three women who wanted to destroy Ghomeshi's life didn't think he would still possess those decades-old emails. But future complainants, whether in the Ghomeshi or in similar cases, they'll take note. And no matter how bizarre future complainants' behavior, no matter how vigorously they pursued their alleged attacker, no matter how often they told him how sweet he was and how they wanted to continue a sexual relationship, so long as they disclose it all, the pressure to believe them will be, I fear, almost irresistible. We're at the point now where nothing a female complainant says or does can be used to disprove her allegation of sexual assault. Feminists may have lost this particular case, but they have laid the groundwork for many future wins in an entirely changed legal climate where the presumption of innocence and the burden of proof have been effectively nullified.